All right, what's up, guys? It's the last video of the weekend. We're going over the Kansas Cup Series final picks for the race on Sunday. So let's jump over into the driver breakdown and we'll just get right into it. So looking at the top range from Larson down to Hamlin, and as you can see, basically every race so far for at least the Cup Series, basically anyone from the 8K range on up is viable in some way. And we will, talk about, why we like some of these different drivers and the ones that we're high on versus not, maybe as high on. But basically anyone from Austin Dillon all the way on up to Larson is in our player pool that we're going to have, if you are building multiple lines, at least some exposure to. We're definitely going to be going heavier on some than others, but I wanted to at least make a note of that. So, looking at the top range, you got Larson, Elliott, Truex, and Hamlin. Larson is really the only one out of this range who I think has the early upside dominating potential. Larson is very expensive. So if you are playing Larson, you potentially are sacrificing maybe, playing two 9K drivers or an 8K driver and a 9K driver together in order to get up to Larson. Now, Larson hasn't met expectations so far this year from a DFS standpoint of just getting out there and leading laps, picking up fast laps, just earning all those dominator points that you would expect of him. He was pretty fast at Darlington last weekend until he spun and then his tires went backwards. And I think that was the reason he kind of had that mechanical failure. But assuming that he doesn't spin, you can kind of start playing the what if game, which is, it doesn't really matter in the grand scheme of things. But from a DFS standpoint, if you just look at the results, you're like, oh, Larson was a terrible play. But, he had good speed. He spun if he was in first or second or third or something like that. And you've actually, put that aside and just focus on this weekend. He has pretty good practice and qualifying times and looks to have a pretty fast car. So I like Larson to be an early lap leader. However, you are paying quite a bit and he hasn't really worked out most of the times this year. So just be aware, but we're not afraid to go right back to him. Elliott would be a little bit more of a safer, probably, cash type of play. The only problem is he's super expensive as well. And it's not a guarantee that he's going to get out front and lead laps. I would say between the two of them, I think Larson has a higher chance and it, only $10 or $200 difference. I think we'd rather go with Larson. But we still like Elliott, quite a bit as well. Yeah, I've reduced some place differential points, and he's probably a little bit more consistent and reliable right now than Larson is. Elliott's the points leader by a pretty wide margin, so don't feel bad about plugging Elliott in whatsoever. Just if you're paying up for one of these expensive drivers, I think you really want to get dominator points out of them, especially if you are going to be rostering some of the chalky place differential plays and lower down on the slate. Then okay, if those other drivers are picking up the place differential points, you also want some drivers in your line that you can pick up some dominator points. I think Elliott has a combination of both, but I think Larson has a little bit more dominating upside. Truex is probably a little bit more of a GPP play. I don't know if he's going to carry a ton of ownership. I think he's probably going to be the lowest owned of the four drivers in this range. But he did have a top three car green flags, speed wise, when you look at Las Vegas early this year, which is probably the most, one-to-one type of comparison that we could make when comparing the tracks. His practice times didn't really stand out too much, today, but the race tomorrow is going to be like 20, 30 degrees cooler than it was today. So take all the practice and qualifying data with a grain of salt, just because I think they're going to handle quite differently tomorrow. Denny Hamlin is another driver that's just been burning people. He's been a DFS disaster, but offers you some place differential, and he had pretty good speed, and he was actually the fastest green flag speed-wise. Again, looking at Vegas, I don't think he had a good result at Vegas. If you just look at the results, you're like, oh, Hamlin was a terrible play. But if you actually just take chunks of the race and you look at how fast the cars were running when the green flag was out, Hamlin ranked number one, and that's what you want to see. So I like getting Hamlin in your line as potentially a lap leader, maybe in stage 2 or maybe even stage 3. Getting down to the 9K range, Byron, I don't know if we're going to have a ton of, but I don't think a lot of people had a ton of them last week either. And yeah, there was a lot of circumstances, but nonetheless, he got out front. He was leading you laps. It looked like he was potentially about to win that race. And then ironically, he finished 13th, right where he qualified for this weekend. So him and Logano have been, in the media all week long, not necessarily for the right reasons for how fast they were in practice and qualifying. Like Logano was a driver who, wrecked in starting DFL basically in a backup car. And, Byron's, all the interview questions have been about last week, not necessarily, how he feels going into this week, just, what are you going to do? So I don't think either of them are going to get into each other, but we're not going to have a ton of Byron. But again, we don't want to eliminate him from our player pool. Really like Kyle Busch and Ross Chastain. Both of them, I feel like, have strong dominator upside and are significantly cheaper than Larson, and also give you some place differential as well. They might not be that early lap leader, but if Larson doesn't jump out and get the early lap lead, there's some other drivers in Reddick and Christopher Bell who are much cheaper, who could potentially cover you for stage one or up until the competition caution, before maybe a Kyle Busch and or a Ross Chastain potentially might take over. Joey Logano is going to be extremely high owned. We see this every single week, I guess, with the Cup Series now, of drivers wrecking out in practice, forfeiting their qualifying laps because they have to go to a backup car to try to fix, the damage, and they just start DFL and carry a ton of ownership. So I think you either play, you have to figure out what you're doing. You have to either plug all three of them in and just be like, all right, I'm going to eat all the chalk and try to get different. In other places, only fade one of the three of them, potentially fade two of the three of them, or maybe even fade all of them altogether. I think you should at least play two of them, maybe one. I don't know if it's a good idea to fade all three. I also don't know if it's a good idea to throw all three of them in there, just because all of them are going to be really high owned. But sometimes it's better just eat the chalk plays that really can't really hurt your line, and then try to get different elsewhere on the slate if some other potential dominator plays are going to be really high owned too, because those dominator plays aren't always as much of a guarantee as like a place differential play is. So we're going to have a lot of Logano, Buescher, and Stenhouse. Bowman and Blaney should come in really low owned. I don't think we're going to have a ton of them, very similar to Byron for us, but you never know. I mean, these are cars that can help you potentially win a tournament, help you get different. So if you're building multiple lines, I think you should be looking at Bowman, Blaney, and Byron. Otherwise, I think you kind of stick with the Bushes, the Chastains, the Hamlins, the Larsons of kind of the top range. And then getting to the 8K range, really like Reddick a lot. I think this could potentially be the week he does get into victory lane. It's crazy. He's finished second. I think there's only one driver I think who's ahead of him who's finished second more than I forget who it is, but I remember hearing that stat on, I think it was NASCAR radio or something like that. I don't know, or maybe it was Twitter. But Reddick's another guy who is able to run the wall, had really fast times in practice and qualifying, ran pretty well at Vegas. Looks like he could be a potentially early lap leader, could pick up your fast laps. So I love the idea of throwing Reddick in your line, even though he does start second. Harvick could be an interesting pivot play if you are fading, potentially a Joey Logano up here, just because it gives you a little bit of salary relief. He still is a place differential play. Didn't really show too much speed in practice and qualifying. But we know that Harvick has consistently been finishing towards the top 10, usually running around, between 8th and 12th, something around that range. So I don't mind if you are fading Logano, maybe coming down to Harvick as a potential pivot play, and it gives you a little bit more salary relief, and, maybe allows you also to get different with a potential dominator. Christopher Bell is going to carry a lot of ownership. It's interesting seeing, again, the driver who starts first being priced this cheap. He was fast in the short run. He was fast on the long run, had a pretty fast car at Vegas. So we're going to have a lot of Christopher Bell as well. But the only thing that goes against him is, the amount of cautions that we're seeing and then the drivers who are also right around him. Like Reddick has a really good chance of just grabbing the lead from lap one. You can make the same argument for Larson. So it'll be interesting between the three of them, kind of which one gets the early jump. But I will say, Reddick and Bell are significantly cheaper than Larson. I'm not even afraid of playing some of those drivers together either, just because I think they all have the potential to pick up fast laps and get out front and lead you laps early in the race. Just because you play a driver first doesn't mean you can't play the driver who starts second or potentially who starts third, especially if you are banking on some other place differential plays. You're going to want multiple lap leaders in your line. Austin Dillon is just probably our fourth interest of this range. Again, you don't want to eliminate him. I think he gives you some nice place differential, but he didn't really show the practice and the times in practice and qualifying. Although, you can be like, well, hey, Reddick, is killing it, but I think it's more of Reddick being able to run that high line and kind of the unique skill set that is. Not really getting the Briscoe or Suarez, definitely not getting the Cindric or Almirola. I think you could make an argument for Keselowski. He's a pretty cheap, potential pivot play as well. If you really want to get, different, really like Eric Jones from an upside standpoint and a finishing potential. I don't know how much ownership he's going to carry, but I like him quite a bit. Kurt Busch would be like a super aggressive GPP play. Maybe even a potential lap leader who you can get for $7,100. I wish he wasn't starting fifth, but I think because he starts fifth, he is going to be very low owned. And Kurt Busch should never be that cheap. He looks to have a pretty fast car this weekend. Stenhouse and Busch are going to be extremely high owned. Most people are probably going to pair them together, so it might not be a bad idea of only playing one of them and trying to get different that way if you are playing Logano, or again just kind of plug those two drivers in and then try to get different elsewhere in your lines. But can't hurt you. They're just going to carry a lot of ownership, so if you aren't playing them, you just hope that one of them runs into issues or finishes deep in the field, and it allows you to kind of get some leverage on the field that way. But it'll be very easy for them to hit value. Bubba Wallace didn't really run that many laps in practice, but the Toyotas have been pretty good at the 1.5. So, you would think that would carry over to the 2311 cars, although they have been wrecking quite a bit here recently. It looks like Kurt Busch has a much better car than Wallace does, but he's still pretty cheap and starts relatively deep in the field. Not getting the Custer. And then depending on how high you want to go, I don't think you necessarily have to come down to the punt range, just depending on who your dominator plays are. But if you are coming down here, we feel the most confident about Gregson, Burton, LaJoie to some extent. He'd probably be the fourth of the three mediums there, and then Gilliland. Fear with Gilliland, he just didn't really show the speed, but if we see cars wrecking out, he could be kind of a pure attrition play and finish north of the top 25 spots. I do really like Gregson and Burton from a speed standpoint. I think their finishing potential is much higher than a lot of the drivers down here. So those would be kind of my two favorite pump plays to go to if you have to get this low. But again, I don't really think you have to. So that's going to do it for the Kansas picks. We'll post this on Twitter like we always do. It's at FastCarsFM. Just wanted to say thanks, one more time for all the support. We are, let's see here. I think I have to update this. I don't know where we're at now, 452 or something like that. So slowly but surely we're getting to the next milestone, which is 500, which is ultimately just halfway to the big ultimate goal, which is 1,000. But nonetheless, it's cool to take those the small stepping stones to get there. And then make sure to check out our support tab too. Like again, our biggest thing is just to grow the channel to 1,000 subscribers, but we have been getting a handful of tips and stuff throughout the season, which is always really appreciated and a really nice gesture from everybody. So any tips that we do get, we just split them, evenly amongst the four of us. No need to do that by any means. Like I said, our biggest thing is just getting up to those, the 1,000 subs. So just keep doing what you guys are doing. Really appreciate it. And best of luck this weekend for Kansas. And we'll see you next weekend for the All-Star race.